This problem says solve each equation by completing the square. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to move things around in such a way that we can get just the x squared and the x on the side by itself. So in order to do that for this first problem here, for number A, we're going to add 13 to both sides because we don't need a number there. So this is going to be x squared minus 6x equals 13. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at what am I going to add to this left side here to make this a perfect square trinomial. And we would take that half of 6, which is this number here. Remember, that's the one we double. And that's going to be a 3. So I'm going to take that 3 and I'm going to square it. So I'm going to get negative 3 and I'm going to square it. So that's going to be 9. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. Now again, I'll show you exactly what I did to get that negative 3 if you didn't catch it. So essentially what I did is my b, I'm going to take half of it. So that's negative, 6 over 2 and square it. So negative 6 over 2 is going to be negative 3. So negative 3 squared is going to be positive 9. So I need to add 9 to both sides. So in the process of that, I get x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals 22. And then from there, now this left side is actually a perfect square trinomial, and it's actually going to factor into x minus 3 squared. So I still think of the idea of, I remember what I squared here to get 9, it was 3. So I know this is going to be 3. And the other thing, I know this is minus because my b is a negative. So that's kind of how that relates together there. So if you catch that, that's going to be really nice. So now this actually equals 22. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to square root both sides. So on the left side, those cancel, the squared and the square root, and I get x minus 3. And on the right side, I get plus or minus square root 22. And then what I'm going to do lastly here is add 3 to both sides. So that gives me x equals 3 plus or minus square root 22. And that's the most you have to do for both of these answers. Well, that's the least you have to do for both these answers to get full credit. Okay, let's do the next one now. So the next one here, this is a little bit more strange here. But I'm going to add 3/16 to both sides. Because remember, I want to keep the x squared and the x on the same side. Everything else I want to move over. So this is going to give me an x squared minus 1/2 x equals 3/16. So now what I'm going to do next is I need to find out what I have to add to this x squared minus 1/2 x to make it a perfect square trinomial. So again, I look at the b, and I'm going to take half of it. What is half of a half? So if you can think of that conceptually, you could see that it's going to be a 1/4. But if you can't, I would have to go 1/2 divided by 2. And this is really 2 over 1. And the way that works is I take that 1/2 and times it by the reciprocal, which is 1 over 2, which this is going to give me 1/4. And it's negative, of course. So what I do with that number is I have to square it now. Okay, so I divide it by 2, and then I square it because I need it to be this number on the end that's supposed to be squared. Like for the first one, it was 9. Because that's a perfect square. So now that's going to give me 1/16 when I square it. So that negative 1/4 squared is going to be 1/16. So that's what I need to add to both sides. So for this side, plus 1/16. And for this side over here, plus 1/16. And then on the left side, I'm going to get x squared minus 1/2 x plus 1/16. And that's going to equal, now for the right side I have 1/16 and I already have a 3/16 over there. So when I add those together, that's going to give me 4/16. And I'm just going to write that down so you can see that. It might be hard to keep in your head. 4/16, and that actually simplifies to 1/4. So this 4/16 simplifies to 1/4 because 4 goes into 4 once and 4 goes into 16 4 times. So for that one, I'm going to write 1/4. And then from here, the left side factors into x minus, 1/4 squared. The minus comes from the b term, and the square root of 1/16 is 1/4. So that's kind of where that comes from. Because 1/4 times 1/4 is going to give me the 1/16. And that equals 1/4. So I'm going to square root both sides. So on the left, I get x minus 1/4 equals 1/2, plus or minus 1/2, excuse me. Because when I square root, it's plus or minus. So now, for the last part of this problem here, I'm just going to move over the 1/4. So how do I do this? All right, I fixed it. So then that's going to be x equals 1/4 plus or minus 1/2. So I'm just going to take this and multiply the bottom by 2 and the top by 2. That's really going to be 2/4. So I'm going to write 2/4 there. And really 1/4 plus 2/4 is going to be 3/4. So x equals 3/4, comma, or I have 1/4 minus 2/4. So that's going to be negative 1/4. So there's both of our answers. So let's move on to the next one now, the third one here. So this one is different because I have a 2 in front of the x squared. So if you notice the previous examples, those were both 1s in front of that. And in order to complete the square, it has to be that way. So what I'm going to do first is divide by 2. Everything. So then I'm going to get x squared minus 3/2 x equals 1/2. And I just did 2 steps in one there. I also moved that 1/2 to the other side. Hopefully you're okay with that. If not, stop, pause the video for a minute and see what I did for the previous one. And that's exactly what I did there. So anyways, so now I need to complete the square here. So I'm going to take that 3/2 negative, divide it by 2. And that's going to give me negative 3/4, and I have to square that. So then that's going to be 9/16. So I need to add 9/16 to both sides. And on the right side here, I'm just going to write that as 8/16 because I need the same denominators for these. Because I'm adding that to both sides. So for the left side, plus 9/16, and for the right side, plus 9/16. I'm going to get x squared minus 3/2x plus 9/16 equals 17/16. Okay, once I get all the same denominators, it makes it really easy with fractions. So then what I'm going to do next here is I'm going to factor this left side. And it's going to factor into x minus, because that's a negative b again. And that's going to be 3/4 squared. And remember, this is square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 16 is 4. So that's where that number comes from there. It comes from this one. Okay, and that equals 17/16. So now I'm going to square root both sides. So on the left side, I get x minus 3/4 equals, and don't forget your plus and minus, And I'm going to end up with the square root of 17 over 4. Because when I see the square root here, this is going to be the square root of 17 over the square root of 16. And the square root of 16 is 4. And that's why we get a 4 down there with no square root over it. The square root is only in the top now. Okay, and then what do I have to do lastly here is move that negative 3/4 over, or minus 3/4. I'm going to plus 3/4 to both sides. And I get x equals 3/4 plus or minus square root of 17 over 4, which since I have the same denominators, I can add my numerators together. Now that doesn't look like you would think it would. It's actually going to be x equals 3 plus or minus square root 17 over 4. And that's going to be the final answer. Now remember, these are all 2-answer problems here, and that doesn't go for every quadratic. I could have 0 answers, I could have 1 answer, I could have 2 answers. I cannot have more than 2 answers though. And if you look at this last one even, this last one is actually 2 answers. And I'm going to write them both out so you don't get too mixed up with these. So this is really 3 plus the square root of 17 over 4, or x equals 3 minus the square root of 17 over 4. And I'm just mentioning that just in case you might be a little confused on those. Now, it could be either one. Either one would be full credit, just so you know. But in the homework, they're probably going to want to see it this way for the most part. There it is.